Hi, cool people. How we doing, cool people?
Hello.
Michael. How you doing, my friend?
I am doing so good. It is so good to see you.
Dimitri, good to see you. I look forward to our talk on Dante. I'd be curious what you've been thinking about. I am revisiting because I have a paper due on Martha Nussbaum's Fragility of Goodness, which is about the
Mm.
category of tragedy in classical thought,
Mm.
and really trying to bring it out in the context of democracy today. I think Miss Nussbaum is quite fascinating. But before I start talking about that, I'd be curious if you're thinking about anything, Michael. What you thinking about?
Yeah. Oh gosh, many things. Well, I've been getting really into Paul Kingsnorth
Hmm.
lately in the last week or so, and I listened to a recent talk he gave that I think Paul Vanderklay plugged, which is how I found out about it. It was a talk on civilizational Christianity
Hmm.
and kind of how he sees it as a implausible solution to the meaning crisis and, meta crises. Um, and I thought he really gave a very compelling, convincing argument um, against it, and I think kind of advocated for much more of a um, I don't just think he was advocating for like civilizational Christianity like on a much smaller scale. I think he was kind of advocating for a like for your theism to inform the way you are in the world, but it to not be an identity marker that you create your whole society around.
Yep.
And how, pretty much every theocratic experiment has just ended in either a war or like the total disintegration um of that religion and sects that form out of it because it's kind of this top down dogma. And so I've been thinking about how how to live in a theistic way and honor ritual and like honor tradition of your of your theism, but um to not impose that on people, to not uh structure your like laws like specifically around that, right? Um so
I am.
yeah, I don't know. It's very kind of, you know, preliminary thoughts, but I think I don't know, I think he's a very fascinating guy. I was also listening to a podcast with him the other day, and he was talking about like his entrance into environmentalism, and the impetus for it was he realized that um, if God was an artist, nature was his artwork, as he said. So like, he was captivated by the divinity in nature. And so that led him to joining the Green Movement and kind of all these other environmental movements. And he said he got disillusioned with it at a certain point because he realized that the the goals and aims of the mainstream environmental movement were really trying to like they talk about sustainability, but it's like sustaining the kind of technocratic state. Like it kind of became this like accounting where you're talking about carbon credits and cutting down emissions, and it's like it's looking at the goals of environmentalism as kind of this like transactional kind of like
Hmm.
harm reduction, right? Instead of like a fully fledged transformation of how we live. Um, and and ultimately for him, like it's about the relationships with nature. That was the question that really thrust him into it. It's like, how do we relate with nature in a way that's not exploitative and destructive and maybe even in its best forms, like just kind of a passive indifference. Like how do we engage with it in a relational way? And um, so I've been thinking about that too, because offer, and it's kind of this like story of how she realizes that the kind of the fragility of the natural world and how she ends up deciding to fight for something that's bigger than herself.
Hmm.
But I've just been thinking about um like can can activism be done without losing the spiritual essence of it all? Like,
Hmm.
does it just inevitably kind of collapse into like down to the level of politics? Even even if it's like energized by people who really care about the world, who want the world to be a better place, um, does it inevitably always kind of collapse to the like how to retain the true kind of purpose, which is, for me, I see it as relationships, as how to relate and how to have contact with, this the sacred, right? So I don't know. Those are just bumbling, rambling
No, not bumbling at
thoughts.
all. I think you're getting at actually what's kind of very appropriate and reminds me of some of the things I was speaking with Jockin last night about in Mr. Luber. So that's delightful. First off, it's raining, so randomly the internet may freeze and die. If so, Zoom's pretty good at letting me come back. So if I vanish, I just noticed it freeze, so forgive me. I don't know Kinsworth's work very well. I have read a bit of it. I've been hearing the rounds on that conversation. I know Joel. So there's a few things. There is a long-standing conversation, then I'll give it to Michelle here, on basically the question of the relation between church and state, particularly Christianity. We can go to Niebuhr. Niebuhr is quite famous on this. I actually like Reinhold and Richard, the brothers. I think they're very interesting. Tillich. One can look at Bonhoeffer, who got to the point he was like, yeah, the Christians should actually try to kill Hitler. Oh, really? And yet, one would not see Bonhoeffer as some sort of extremist, right? He actually saw it as a moral duty. There's a lot of different thoughts. Basically, I think we are at the point where politics is stuck going back and forth forever in a dialectic, until we begin to figure out what exactly it is we want to do with our politics and what it is the goal of our politics. So for example, many Christians, and I think many religions have the same thing, for many years have said, well, we shouldn't be involved. The state is separate from the religion. Well, unfortunately, there are things in your religion that says you can't do that, right? So you have to engage in an exegesis that goes against it. And you say, well, maybe it's okay because Jesus said unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Does that mean don't interact with the state? Or figure out what's involved with the state and what's not? And what do you do if the state starts passing laws that says that you can't have religious communities, or starts passing laws that goes against your beliefs or stuff like that? Or says that you're using the roads, right? If you're using the roads, you're participating in the state, but you don't think you should pay taxes, that's somehow feeding a war machine. And you kind of feel like you're forced to participate in something. It's the problem. I think a lot of these tensions arises with the problem of finding yourself having agreed to a social contract you never signed, which is one of the great tensions of all political legitimacy, right? Because you're just born into something. And I think this is what has happened. Dr. James Hunter, in his book Before the Shooting Again, which basically he came up with the term culture wars. And he's a big influence on Belonging Again Part 1 and Belonging Again in general. But he's writing in 1990 where he sees the beginning of the abortion debate as creating a new political reality that will lead to a reemergence of popularism, reemergence of extremism, and all the stuff that happened. Because he's like, we haven't figured out how to do what he called substantive democracy. And what substantive democracy is the ability to debate from different first principles, basically different religions, and be able to have real political discourse where consensus and compromise is reached, as opposed to simply who can garner enough votes to domineer the other. Because in all honesty, American democracy is basically who's gonna have power for 4 years. That's what it is now, and it's just a swinging back and forth. And he's like, the only way to actually get democracy, which is more than merely a determination of who has the power, but actually a qualitative process of discerning the best outcome for the society, would require people to talk from their first principles. Michael, please.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to interject quickly. That reminds me of like that finding commonality of the dodo effect in psychotherapy, where all of these different modalities are not more or less successful than one another. And so the work is finding the commonalities between all of them. And the number one predictor of good therapy is the therapist relationship with the client. It's the relationship through and through, and how you dress that in what modality it is secondary. And John Vervaeke just made this argument recently in a video that I watched, where it's like we should be doing the same things with the religions. Like we should be looking at what is it that works about all of them together. And he's on about the philosophical Silk Road and he kind of abandoned the religion that's not a religion moniker, but like he's kind of obsessed with like how can we orient towards the sacred in a way that transcends and includes all of these different groups. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, but yeah, you're saying great things.
No, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, to say something very large and then pass it to Michelle and Mr. Jockin, all of this comes down, and I've said it a few times, all of it comes down now today to realizing the dream of Leibniz for a universal science, which is a rigorous and reliable capacity to determine the quality of the mean by which we can judge what exactly we want, not on quantitative grounds, but qualitative grounds. You said it with environmentalism. Environmentalism went to quantification, so died. Capitalism went to quantification, so died. Basically, politics has gone to quantification and died. Do we have the most votes or not? We are in the age now that must learn to coordinate a quality of experience. And all of these fields now are shifting to qualitative. Does your science have the quality of eureka? Does your economics have the quality of well-being? Does your religious dialogue have a quality of interaction that is only possible because of the interfaith dialogue that is not quantifiable but very experientiable? You mentioned Van der Kleef. He kind of talks basically about that with this corner of the internet. Everything is now qualitative, right? And if democracy is fundamentally a speech act, which I think if we follow Tocqueville it is, then you've got to learn how to have quality conversation. And that what is that between difference but psychoanalysis? Like once you get between difference, it's going to be psychoanalysis. Everything is now learning the art of quality, which we don't even really believe is real in the modern world, right? So we're screwed. And we were basically saying last night that the only way that interplural, interreligious, all of these, the only possibility of a substantive democracy has to be based on a metaphysical structure like the partial object that we see in beauty. That has the possibility. We based politics on truth. We based it on good, but now we need to base it on the beautiful, right? And that's kind of what I think we're moving toward, because otherwise you can't. I think we're just stuck going back and forth on the interreligious, do we get involved with politics or we not? We just kind of go back and forth forever. Ultimately, if you say we shouldn't be involved in politics, I do think you have to end up with a Leopard Coast smaller scale, basically Amish. And Amish is not anti-technological. They are a communitarian structure, right? And that's kind of the direction you start to go into, for good and for bad. How to have that awareness of technological essence without over-isolation, whatever that means, and people that could actually negotiate and democratically determine what technologies to introduce or not, is really a challenge that we have not thought. But if we do not think it, we're just going to keep seeing power government. Basically government and democracy as exchanges of power, religion as numbers, environmentalism as numbers, and so on and so forth. So I think what you're getting at is a utterly critical discussion. But let me give it to Michelle and Mr. Jockin. And Pay is excellent on Descartes, Dimitri. You may have heard we're trying to pressure Pay to do a class. And if he watches this, Pay, do a class on freaking like Descartes. There seems to be like a lot of magic there. But let me give it to Michelle. Michelle.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you guys, and yeah, great conversation. And I really love this question, Michael, that you posed about activism, and does it always like kind of inevitably end up just being kind of like very transactional and sort of become something that it doesn't, like, it's not in its essence, even though it doesn't mean well, like it means very well, right? But it ends up becoming something that it's really strays from that essence. I was kind of thinking about that, and I feel as though there's something that makes me think like that fundamentally it's always going to be about like our own choices and what we do, because that's harder though, because then we have to do it ourselves, and often that feels like a lot or like impossible even. But I do feel like sometimes some of the things that I would love to see change on like a systematic level, I realize like may ultimately boil down to trying to make my own, like, you know, what they say, vote with your dollar kind of thing. Like, how are you actually, like, what are you actually investing in? What are you actually doing? And sure, like there's part of me that's almost like something that, you know, is hugely systematic that I think is, you know, broken or not right. Like, I think there's a part of it where, yeah, I'm not saying that like activism can't bring awareness to certain things, but I do think that I've probably like have had more sort of big shifts in terms of like how I think about things from just other moms like sharing about their own experiences and the things that they've come to themselves, and maybe the shifts that they've done in terms of how they live or what they do or what they purchase or something like that. Because it's like it you know, it's, yeah, in a way it's almost like, can't the people who like run these things like, you know, just not allow this and allow this and don't. And I'm not saying there's no place for that. Again, I think there could be something, like some people seem to be almost called to have that type of a role, like getting up in front of representatives and talking to people about certain issues, you know. And but I think though, unless you really feel like that strongly to be a part of what you do, and I mean literally like, you know, doing the hard stuff, not just like the protest. I'm not saying there's no place for protesting, but, you know, not just the simply, I like identifying with some activism. Okay, well, what does that actually do? Like, what can you change in terms of your own habits and maybe creating new habit loops that then possibly, sure, it's like hard to see how that would change things on a massive scale, but I don't know that we can ever change things on a massive scale. Like, I think it's always going to have to be very small and slow. But at the same time, it's kind of like remarkable how much we can change and how many people who do commerce or do different things, like thinking about environmental impact. Like, there are people out there who care and who are creating businesses that actually honor the earth or honor, you know, whatever it is that you feel particularly like, you know, passionate about. And so it's like, try to seek out those people and try to support those people. And I don't know that there's like, I'm currently talking, baby. I will be right there. I need you now. I feel so needed all the time. It's a beautiful thing. I'm grateful for that. So I don't mean to like, I don't know if that seems like I'm being a party pooper or something. I'm not saying like, I think things can change in big ways on the bigger scale, or like, you know, in government or systematic stuff. But like, I do think it ultimately comes down to people realizing what is the small thing I can do toward that value or toward that you know, that hope I have for systematic change. And that's the best activism you can possibly have, in my opinion, or at least it's the most like accessible and the most like the thing that actually seems to ultimately have the difference. But it's hard because it's like it takes effort, and it takes rewiring, and it takes like changing your habit loops, which can be so difficult. And when you just mayhem in the background, I don't know if you guys hear all that well. Anyway, so that's my thoughts. Just a quick little reflection on what your question is. I'm not saying that like fully answers that question. It's just some thoughts that came to mind on my initial gut reaction is, I think activism can have its place, but I have found in my own personal experience that whenever I kind of like identified with some sort of activist cause, it almost made me not think as much about what am I actually doing and how am I living differently. Now, some people can do both at the same time, good for them. But like, it's about like, maybe as in this season of life, the energy level is like, how much can I put toward actually doing something differently or having things be different? And it's like, you know, they're like what people want to buy. Like, I watched a really interesting documentary. It's like what people want to buy is going to influence the people selling, because they're like, okay, we weren't thinking about having organic at our store at all, but now that people actually want organic, we're going to actually try to like develop that market. Now you could say, well, that's kind of still business minded and blah blah blah, but you know, this guy who started Stonyfield was like, but you know, my friends who are totally anti-capitalistic can't disagree, because he used to be on the side of like, oh, no business and business is all bad. But he's like, well, the fact that, you know, Walmart wants to carry our brand and they're going to choose organic over something else, you can't deny like how that impacts, like that is a positive impact. Like there are numbers and concrete things you can see of how that makes a difference between making a different type of like a commercial option for people or market option for people. There's still questions there, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
No, I think it's magnificent. Well, I've been thinking more, we make a distinction between scale and spread as we get later in belonging again. And I think more and more we need to see, and I think this is backed by history, the difference between large scale and compounding spread. Because a lot of the things that are little things, there's little things that don't have compounding potential, which will probably not change the culture. But then there are little things that do have compounding potential. And you see what's very interesting is a lot of the large scale things, which necessarily have to go to power and institutions, tend to be more fragile. Whereas compounding small things tend to be more anti-fragile and things people come to change their habits to want. And also large scale runs into the Marcise Olson institutional incentive structures, the stuff Jonathan Rauch talks about in Government's End, obviously Yarvin, who, talks all about these, the larger the scale, the more you have institutional factors that actually inhibit transformation. Also, what's interesting is, yes, law teaches, as Robert George stresses. So if you change the scale, you can teach people different behaviors. But what's very interesting is often what the law teaches may teach resentment, and it also may teach a backlash. Yeah, it can shift the Overton window, but it doesn't tend to integrate into long-term habits. Whereas a compounding spread, I think we are in the age, because of the social coordination mechanism, where the effectiveness of of compounding spread is now qualitatively greater, and we actually can engage in compounding activities that bring about real transformation in the polis that are not as susceptible to game theory dynamics that emerge in institutional logics that keep there from being real changes. So, I think that's a big deal. And yeah, sure, going to the local market doesn't necessarily, it doesn't seem like it has a large scale impact. But because you now have information technologies that communicate the idea of going to the farmer's market, even on an Instagram, yeah, you can say people are just doing it to show off and they don't actually care. Let's say it's true. Let's say that 98% of the people on Instagram showing themselves going to local farming are just performing. They're still putting the idea out there. Like the idea is still out there, right? Which could coordinate activities and imagination that otherwise couldn't happen. And maybe you get a reaction to that where people say, well, they're all just fake trad people showing off. We're going to have a real farm, dang it, and not put it on Instagram. Well, that's actually a product of the social coordination as a reaction against the fakeness, right? And so I think the power of the social is the compounding. And the other thing I would say that is, I think, very important, large-scale activities like governmental transformations can take 12 years. And you go, wow, that's a long time. But it has a big impact. But compounding spread is probably more like 40 years, which is longer than large scale. But please note it's not forever longer, and it's not impossible. And you could argue it's in half a lifetime if the average is 80 or something, which actually a lot of people, it's around 72 or 80. It depends on who you look. So I think when, there's a way where when we say little things that make a difference, if we look at the little things, and then I'll give it to Jockin and Dimitri, if we look at the little things we're doing and we go, well, actually, this has compounding potential. Well, then it's a compounding, maybe the language we should use for it is I'm doing a compounding thing more than a little thing, because the word little has a kind of discrediting. Oh, it's just a small thing to go to the farmer's market. It doesn't make a big deal, right? Well, if we don't use the language of small, maybe, although small is beautiful following that Shumteter thinker and different or Leopard Coast, sure, that's fine. But most people view small within a contrast to government, which is large. But actually, if you go, well, it's a compounding thing, and actually, the polis has the power of compounding that the government doesn't seem to have, because every 4 years, the government gets replaced. They have power, they have law. They don't really compound. They use the monopoly of violence to enforce, right? The logic of institutions is not compounding. The logic of institutions is more, you must, or you go to jail. Obviously, banks have CDs and interest rates, but I'm talking about social compounding, right? That seems to be where a lot of our power is in the polis. And then the question is simply, what do we organize our compounding around? What do we compound toward? And how do we create the social infrastructure to maintain that compounding over the long term? And I do think with the social coordination mechanism, this becomes more possible than it was perhaps in the past at scale. In the past, compounding tended to be more locally and geographically bound. It may be more spreadable now. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and Dimitri. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you again, sir.
Time no see. Okay. Thank you for teasing our discussion from last night. I enjoyed that. Michael, I want to bring up some points of what you're saying. So I've been reading recently the Scott report. Basically, there was a lot of research and policy in England post-World War II, between World War I and World War II. It's incredibly fascinating. Mainly, I have to credit basically a YouTube channel I ran into called Farming Explained, where it was very much systematically presented that there really was a conscious question asked, what is the way England is supposed to be organized in terms of its farmland, its agriculture, and the relationship of the city, the urban to the rural. And it's very it actually almost refreshingly blunt about what the nature of the relationship is. And a lot of the policies related to it. So for example, one of the issues or points brought up was the idea of cheap food. That's one of the purposes of agriculture, of the urban environment, of the rural environment. One of the purposes is to provide cheap food for the urban population. Now, that's very important because the contention of organics and other kind of intercessions of ecology, this is a huge tension part. There's actually there's a tension about this because that law policy, a policy of England, was about cheap food, and farmers contributing to that, and that's the purpose of the rural land, is to contribute to that. There's another one related to basically recreation and open space, but even then, it made it very clear it had to be engineered. It was not to be. It was not meant to be just follow land, to just be let be in nature. No, it was supposed to be actively worked on and built an urban plan with a very certain kind of growth development, basically to maintain those rural areas. I just bring this up because part of how activism is coming up or being discussed, especially with ecology, I do think there's almost like these presuppositions are not being addressed or being acknowledged. So I was just thinking about that report or that work in England at that time, because I think we're very much living with that consequences of those lines of thought. I'm saying that because Robert Moses was trained in England, for example. He was an urban planner in America, from where I grew up on New York, Long Island. He basically designed our entire infrastructure. And the logic was the idea, like our major highways along Long Island were structured about parkways. That's not an accident, because the logic was we had to give urban populations access to rural land. So the entire wave of my people, to use that weird language, but it's entire culture, was generated through policies from England about the relationship of rural to urban land. So actually, in terms of the question of activism, I think the big question is, what do we mean by that? And are we really prepared for usually a good activism would have to acknowledge the reasonings, because cheap food is actually very important, because malnutrition was a very significant issue. It's really ironic because that actually leads to a serious question right now. A lot of people argue we're malnourished now, but in a different modality or different way than what was talked about back then. But anyways, I think these are things that I'm reminded from what you're talking about, Michael. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Now, kind of related to that is that's why I just kind of what Daniel said, that first principles part. This is not even just about religion. This is at the part of what do we value, and making the presumption that we all agree about the same first principles. My God, hell no, absolutely not. That is absolutely not the case. So I actually think about, I don't know, and Michael, I don't think you were part of the net when this happened. I was on this call with you, I was in the group and talking about it, but I got mixed up on Twitter with this Christian that was basically lighting up typical anti-Muslim rhetoric. And actually I engaged with them directly. I went for it with them. And it was a very rewarding experience because, yeah, it devolved into name calling at the end. But for about a hot minute, it was incredibly enlightening because a presuppositional first principle about faith and one's relationship to faith, meaning basically the divine can basically kind of summarize from Kierkegaard, the ethical versus the moral, right? So that I touched on Abraham with the idea when he was told to go sacrifice his son. I was pointing out, I got news for you, but as a prophet we both recognize, how can you justify, like, if you can see something that's clearly ethically wrong, like we would all say is ethically wrong to kill your son. Anyone did that today, we would instantly stop them. We would say they're wrong. Yet God commanded it, and He did it. And we actually, through talking it through, I revealed a presupposition of that individual, which was, no, he did it, but he was in pain. He knew it was wrong, but he still did it. I found that amazing that was revealed. It was through a discourse, because that's a completely different relationship of faith, a completely different one than an Islamic tradition, or even quite a lot of Christian traditions too. Especially the more classical position about it. That was very fascinating. So my point is, I'm just sharing this to point out, like, I thought that was an example of like working through in radical difference, an antagonistic difference, by the way. It really was, trust me. It was one of the lowest derogatory insults basically about Islam that was presented. But in a purely antagonistic environment, I seek to understand and working through what was the presuppositions of what the argument was, and asking for, give me a mapping. How is this case different from this case when we're using a common prophet as a reference point to talk about this? And through the disagreement, we saw through a presuppositional difference. That was very rewarding. Now there's much clarity about that point that came from there. So I say that because, and actually, I'm glad to see Jacob here, because that relates to my conversation with him, which is beauty. Basically, as I said to Daniel and Nicole last night with them, I was having a conversation with them. I really do believe beauty is natural theology by another name, because it was funny, because on that call, we had a Jewish person from a Jewish background, we had a Muslim, we had a Christian all in the room, and we all agreed on beauty. Isn't that interesting? Even though we all these complete different theologies or in different backgrounds from this, beauty was the thing that allowed us to coordinate together. And it had to be talked through a very particular mode of it, because that's the very big danger, is that usually beauty is very, very fragile. And this is why the discussion Daniel was saying about relationships. Relationships are inherently fragile. They can't be collapsed and quantified. They're multidimensional. So thus collapsing them, it's a very natural move because it makes things more efficient, not effective, efficient. And it leads to basically usually collapse into the good. The good is very effective. It's a very good instrument of the mind, according to Aristotle, of getting things, of making activity happen. It's very useful. But the problem is when you have these contentionals of first principles, they're not going to coordinate. And especially on things like ecology, where there's actually serious going to be problems about food, basically food access to cheap food and saving the planet. It's going to be, that's a huge, it's basically on the same level as the abortion debate. I would say, I think it's basically the same in terms of magnitude of complete different first principles of priority and how you're going to have to resolve that or come to a resolution or harmony of those 2 points. Last one, Daniel, I want to bring up one issue, or not issue, but his point, this compounding spread, right, or scale kind of relationship together. So I just read a study, it's really interesting. So one of the things in education, I guess, doesn't get talked about is that we have to deal with social behaviors and norms. We're not just content delivery. So when there was a study done where basically that relates to this idea of policies and laws, where if only one teacher set up a certain normative code, like a normative procedure within the classroom, let's say a certain protocol of, I'm trying to remember the exact study, but what was the protocol? But basically like a kind of how they answer, like basically just the normative culture of being in the classroom, like showing up in a certain classroom time and then acting in a certain way in the class. When they did a study where only one teacher did that versus all the teachers of that department, like all the students basically, because it was a middle school. So they went to different periods, so all 8 periods. So they did it, they reviewed what would happen if they did the sample against one subject, like one classroom was only doing the behavior norm versus the whole group was synchronized, all doing the same action, the same intervention. Basically, it took 1/10 the time to get along the results and a much longer sustaining of it when it was synchronized across the 10 educators versus when there's only one. So that's a really interesting example, because also I think of things like in boxing, for example, where so if an action is done by one part of the body alone, it does not create a powerful punch. It actually requires a synchronicity of multiple parts happening in a certain time sequence together to create a kinetic chain. Lots of other sports have that same property. So what I'm getting at here is this idea of compound scale or compound spread or effect is a very small change in synchronicity can create a very compound effect that's monstrously huge compared to just the individual act. That's why I'm bringing this up. So I'm not even totally, I mean, just on Michelle's point about political activity, I'll close on this, or activism, it may not be what we think it is. Like, we think it has to be this kind of aggregation. Notice the most political modes are like aggregations of just like masses of people, versus I think maybe there's another modes of political activity that are much more subtle, right? These kind of cultures and norms and habituations that are very subtle and seem very small on their own, but then when done compounded by multiple in different intervals of time and different people, they can have a much larger effect. I also say this because a big issue of virtue ethics is a very serious critique. Jordan Peterson got blasted on this with Zizek when they had a debate with each other about this, is when problems are just a huge scale, when they're systematic scales, policies, law, institutions, how can you justify focusing on the self of individuals when there's collective or aggregative wrongs or vices that have to be addressed? It's a serious question, because if you just leave to a typical virtue ethics as individualistic, you can't answer that question. Or it's like it's a shrug of, yeah, take care of yourself, everything else will figure itself out. People don't feel satisfied with that answer. And then people will just default, no, we have to change this injustice, this vice from the policy perspective. My personal viceful or virtue does not matter. What matters is the entity, right? There's a disconnect. So I'm just bringing it up to say maybe this kind of example. That's I should go for, like, I'll put a link up afterwards to that study I found. That kind of synchronicity of norms or active intervention could have compounding larger effects than this individual act itself. So I appreciate that, Daniel.
Sure. No, I don't disagree at all. Absolutely, there is the possibility of law being used to create medium or environmental conditions that allow there to be synchronicity that creates changes in culture. Robert George is very good on that. Unfortunately, the greater the scale, I think often the law is captured by institutional interests that go in the favor of regulation and special interest groups rather than creating different cultures, so it becomes an ineffective means of social coordination. However, there are examples of local laws or federalist, basically, projects of experimentation, and if law was used to facilitate experimentation of different social coordination, that would be great. But unfortunately, the more and more centralized it is, it doesn't tend to be employed that way. I wish it would be. One of the hopes, I think you said it very well, the more synchronicity you have of social activity, that becomes really important. Well, that's why the social coordination mechanism of the liminal web, et cetera, can be very useful, because then you have the possibility of synchronicity because people see all of the activity occurring. And if then they have the legal freedom or the space by which to engage in that synchronicity, you can see a change in culture. So I don't mean to say that law is polar opposite of compounding potential. I think basically once it gets captured by institutional interest or different things, it loses its experimental flavor. And then the culture it creates tends to be the one that is studied by the institutions, picked by the scientific journals, and that they're willing to look into. So then you get data that only favors the pre-existing ideas of the kind of culture you want to see, and then the experimentation doesn't spread to allow these different possibilities of social organization. However, if you had better quality information and better examples of things that might be moved into law to create spaces of experimentation because they have been witnessed on the liminal web or they've been seen in the social coordination, well, then you could have a information pipeline, basically. And then if simply people have the ability to try different formats and different principles and different rules to synchronize behavior, could become more effective. So I think basically there has not been again, I'll just keep saying, there has not been a social coordination mechanism to keep there to be a social creative imagination that would offer alternatives to the institutional logic that tends to be captured by the special interest groups or the people in power or the previous paradigms, that then means any experimentation that occurs is actually already pre-ranged by that pre-configuration, and therefore you don't see new possibilities. And thus the compounding that does occur is the compounding of a Jonathan Rout's, the special interest groups are K Street compounds, not us as human beings and our social possibility. There always is going to be something compounding. The question is it going to be compounding the human or the loss of the human? Will it be compounding the corporation, or will it be compounding the community? And that's why I think this space, and Mr. Kishere, it's good to see. I enjoyed your conversation with with Mark. That was wonderful. And what y'all were talking about the field and adding to the field. Yeah, like the more this liminal web dialogos adds to the field and people can stumble upon these ideas, that opens the possibility of social experimentation and synchronicity that would have the compounding effect that occurs on the polis be in favor of the human, as opposed to, say, the institutional or the pre-configured, or things like that. And yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to Dimitri and Michael, well, two things. That suffering you said with Abraham, basically what Martha Nussbaum says is that democracy is that suffering, when you have to make an existential choice between competing goods. Like, she makes the example of, she says, if you have to, she says in her conversation with Bill Morris, she's like, let's say you're a woman and you have to choose between pursuing your career and raising your children. That's a genuine existential choice. And you can say, well, no, my career doesn't matter and it's what my children, so I won't go to that meeting tonight at 7 o'clock because ultimately it doesn't matter. Seems like no one says that. You're delusional. Of course you feel tortured by the choice of will you be there at that meeting or will you be there for your children, right? You can't simply say the children are more important than work and thus you do not worry about the decision of work. Likewise, you can't simply say, oh, I know that that my beliefs are more important than government, so I don't worry about being involved in the election. No, every single election you have, say, Christians wondering should they even vote, and they're existentially tortured by it. You said, this is her point. You simply can't claim that one good is better than the other and therefore not go through emotional torment, right? You will have to go through emotional torment if you genuinely believe these things are good. And she says, and guess what democracy is? The process of being stuck between all these goods, and that's the tragedy and torment of it. Oh, and this is her other point. Because that actually is democracy, where the populace is constantly caught between competing goods that makes them feel existential, the tendency of people will be to vote for strongmen and authoritarians, and to actually move democracy out of the existential into the place of power. Because the fragility of goodness, the tragedy of trade-offs is too much, but that's what democracy demands. And you take that seriously. Yeah, that's pretty intense, man. And sees the fragility of goodness is, I think, a very important book, because we do not associate. Here's the issue. We associate the existential feeling with we need to change and get the other party in power. She's saying that the existential feeling is the evidence that democracy is doing what it's supposed to do. Well, that's a very different orientation, right? And who would want to live under democracy if it means you have to make these existential choices between competing goods? Well, apparently people don't. That's what's going on. And so if we don't raise the quality of the social field or social interaction, or come to terms getting habituated to the existential, the lack, integrate with anxiety, then we're not going to handle it. You're just going to fall back on various strongmen. So she's very good on that. And then, yeah, I mean, basically, if we take Leibniz seriously, like what you were saying with the debate with the individual on who's right and who's wrong, if instead of quantity or winning, our metric was the Leibnizian quality, then when you go into a conversation with someone, you're not looking to see if you win. You're actually paying attention to the quality of the field, the quality of the conversation. Even if you're right, if the quality was aggressive and bad, you failed following Leibniz because the quality was bad. Likewise, if you go into environmentalism and you said, yes, we've reduced carbon, we've planted trees, but the quality of human life now sucks, you failed as an environmentalist. And I actually think Charles Einstein's Sacred Economics makes the point that humans are actually like stewards of the environment that can have a really important role. And Tyson, the Australian, talks about that, right? So asking questions of environment in terms of quality, not quantity, politics in terms of quality, religious dialogue in terms of quality, everything in terms of quality is a very, very different question than quantity, right? And that's what Leibniz says, that there's basically no possibility of a science of quality or relation without a subject that goes into various sectors determining the quality. Like for him, he says, if you go into a scientific journal and they have a lot of a scientist and he has a lot of citations, but when you talk to him, there's no quality of, say, passion or genius or insight. Well, then Leibniz would say that's a failure because he's lost the quality of the eureka, right? So, but then you have to have people who can judge quality. Oh, how do you do that? How do you teach people to judge quality or to discern quality, right? Really, really hard. And seems like it required a social coordination mechanism for that training to even begin to be possible. But we seem to be at the age where the discernment of quality is what is necessary to move to the sublation of politics, to the sublation of philosophy, art, everything. We're in the age, you can only deal, and then I'll move to Dimitri, you can only deal with problems of globalization and pluralism by moving to the realm of quality assessment. If you're dealing with quantity, well, then it's who gets the most quantity in their difference. How can quantity bring difference together? Because quantity, you can only quantify things that are similar, right? So you have to make difference similar to quantify it. Well, now you've reduced it, right? So if you want to maintain difference as difference, it must be on terms of quality, which means you have to have people that can assess quality. Well, how do you learn that? Well, that's what we have to do. But let me give it to Dimitri and Michael. Dimitri, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. And congratulations on the release, sir. Dimitri.
Yes, hello. Hi. I think there's one normal percentage point left for my computer, and then it will start turning very slow. It looks like I'm in a very dark place, but actually it's not like that. There's light around me. It's just some technical issues that do
There's
not matter.
always light around you, Dimitri. Wherever you go, there's light.
Well, yes, but inside of me, it's a different story. Anyway, Descartes was a predecessor to Leibniz, of course. You know, Leibniz was, of course, mainly a student of Spinoza. Actually, I just read all of Descartes' main writings to go to Spinoza and then later on, hopefully, to Kant and then back to the science of logic. That's the big plan. But yeah, I really liked what you said on quality, because so for Descartes, there's 4 different ways of getting wisdom. 4 roads. And there's, like, for example, just like having a notion clear to you as innate knowledge, just experiencing things from the senses, or just conversing with people, or reading good instructions, always helpful when you buy something. But then there's also the 5th one. And the 5th one is philosophy, which seeks out like first causes and like the true principle, like the first principles. And then you can start deducing from that. That's philosophy. But then, what about divine revelation? Is that also not a viable road for Descartes? Well, Descartes said yes and no. Yes, in the way that it is. It shows us, it reveals to us infallible truth, absolute truth. No, because it's not about the degree of reality. So, like, basically, to cut a long story short, philosophy for Descartes concerns itself with degrees of reality, which are quantity. Oh yeah, I knew this was gonna happen. I knew this was gonna happen. Wait, just give me a second. Okay, perfect. Oh yeah, so divine revelation, right? It's not included in the roads to wisdom for Descartes, because divine revelation is about, let's say, the absolute quality of truth, God, the infallible quality of truth, God, not the relative degrees of reality. Because for Descartes, this is actually where philosophy comes in. Philosophy concerns itself with the relative, not the absolute. It concerns itself with degrees of reality, that which is more real or less real. But how can things be more or less real? And I think, I don't know, I'd have to go through Leibniz, but I think this is something that actually, this was a conversation going on in the 17th century that Leibniz decided to deal with in a different way than Descartes did. And I definitely side with Leibniz here. That the conversation has to be about the difficulty of qualitative difference. And like, because that's what opens up there, according to like Descartes, is that you open up divine revelation into philosophy. Not, you don't leave it aside and like, okay, well, that's God, so we don't touch upon it. No, actually, the problem of the absolute nature of God, or absolute truth, or infallible truth, so-called infallible truth, they are perhaps to be contested within philosophy. And yeah, I mean, my article that I'm writing, inspired by Descartes, is actually gonna go into the position of God in Descartes, because all the major critics of Descartes, from the most early critics to throughout the centuries, posterity, they were all saying, oh, Descartes, you come up with the I think, therefore I am, as this substantial, self-subsistent truth. So what's the need of God? And Descartes, how is God not just an afterthought for you, Descartes? That's kind of the things they would say to him. And I don't think we can blame Descartes. I think actually this shows the strength of Descartes. But that's gonna open up a topic that's that I'll just set aside for now, because it's in my article. And yeah, and so one more thing about Descartes and this type of stuff is that Newton is definitely also, I mean, he was living at the time of Leibniz, right? And I think really a lot of problems that we have, like one of the things I talk about in this article, is that we've all kind of become Newtonians nowadays. And I mean this in a pejorative sense, because Newton said, physics, beware of metaphysics. And Hegel's response to this was that it would be like saying, it's like saying, thinking, beware of thought. It's kind of ridiculous. It's like, just plow through it, pull yourself through that very extremity of your conclusions and see what that will be made of it. But I think this like, yeah, there is this sense to this quantification of everything. And I think Jacob, you were mentioning, right, the likes and like the success by the viewer count and the likes and how many shares I got. And I was having this conversation with this young artist, getting so like hundreds of thousands listenings on Spotify. And like she was talking how it's actually, she's not gonna get paid because of this. Like she teaches singing, but she's not getting paid so much for going viral on Spotify. But I don't know. I was just trying to bring to her the idea that maybe what matters most in making music is just doing it together with the people you're, doing it with, working on these projects together. I don't know. And that was somehow unsettling for her, or like disturbing in the sense that, I don't know, she realized that she kind of forgot about this thing and just kind of was chasing some more. But I mean, I think I'm not exempted from this, right? Like I don't think, I think we're all Newtonians. We all look at, okay, did this thing get more likes, or this? Is that successful? But maybe that thing which is actually the most successful doesn't get the likes because it's just not the right time and place for it. Maybe not for you, but for whoever is receiving this. So yeah, it's something very strange to live with and to navigate. But thank you. I really have to go. It's so late here.
We love you, Dimitri.
We're gonna talk next week. Then
Yay!
that's gonna be crazy. I'm a bit
Look,
intimidated.
I'm thrilled. Cleo is so fantastic. I
Yeah,
I
she was
adore
amazing.
her. Well, Dimitri, thank you and everything. Yeah, every single day I'm increasingly convinced that the quality of the dialogue they were having back then was just 1,000 times higher than ours. It's like we're just really dumb, you know. But Leibniz and Descartes and Foucault and Newton, all like we really like. Again, it's like Jockin's class on Plato. It's like our understanding of the great thinkers is so freaking poor, it's remarkable. Like it's just something else. But anyway, I definitely well, first, the good life is something you can only grow into. The good life is not something you can go get off a shelf or speed ahead by getting a bunch of likes on a video or making a lot of money by 30. The good life has to be grown into. Sure, maybe you can add some fertilizer to the growth with some extra money here and maybe some connections here. You can add some fertilizer, but the good life is not it's more like a garden. You grow into it, right? And you see lots of people who become very successful, but they didn't grow into their success, so their success actually destroys them. Their fame makes them crazy. Look at all the scandals in Hollywood, right? You know, like the good life is grown into. And the good life, you feel the goodness of the good life when you're growing into it, right? And I do think, to use Jacob's language from his recent talk, the good life is a field. It's more like a field. It's a social field. It's a certain mode of being that you have, that you grow into by a certain exploration of the good, the true, and the beautiful in terms of virtue. And you cannot accelerate it. But there are more effective ways to go about it. And basically, until the liminal web, we didn't have a very good, effective social coordination mechanism for growing into the good life, right? Because the good life is way more about relationships, learning how to interact with difference, learning how to talk, learning how to appreciate the little things, learning how to use your money well, or different things like that. Well, if you didn't happen to live around people who could teach you that, or maybe you go to college for 4 years and do that, the amount of experimentation, I guess I would say, by which you could go to determine or work with the things that make the good life were very limited. And maybe you found it in your local community, if you were lucky. But if you did, the good life may have been, the field of the good life could have been bound to, say, Christianity or Islam or atheism or New York or Virginia, and could not spread beyond that without unveiling its fragility and falling apart, right? So in a globalized, pluralized world, to find the field of the good life, you need a more longitudinal, effective social coordination mechanism by which you can train yourself in the variables that allow the growing into the good life, right? Which is a quality of field. Well, we have that, and basically, we're developing that, and basically, I don't think you can have a politics that can deal with the tensions that you were bringing up, Michael, or that can deal with the problem of first principles or anything, unless it is approached by people who feel like they're growing in the good life. Like, if they don't feel like they're growing in the good life, they won't have the existential stability to be able to discuss their most precious beliefs, or to be able to discuss things they don't know the answers to, or to explore, right? If you don't feel like you're growing in the good life, which ultimately, when I think people talk about meaning and belonging, which are distinct, but basically, unless you feel like you're growing in the good life, you do not feel like you have those things. Like, you may say you have those things, but they feel very shallow, or they feel fragile, or they feel something that you're losing or could lose, right? So you have to maintain a feeling of growing in the good life, which, please note, is a what? Qualitative experience, not quantitative experience, a qualitative experience, right? The more you feel like you're growing in the good life and that your life has that quality, and of course, philosophy is about the good life, as some people will generally say, which is the beautiful life, of course. But if you're growing in that, then you have the existential stability, I think, to be able to actually engage in questions of first principles, to engage in questions of like maintaining the work of doing the small things to engage in social compounding. If you do not have that, all of these different fields are going to collapse. Because people are going to be overwhelmed by encounters of the real, of the con, overwhelmed by anxiety, or so on and so forth, right? But that means people understand that what they're looking for is a certain quality of experience, not quantity of experience. And I think what Dimitri was saying, and that just gets to what you're saying, Mr. Jockin, what is the quality, though, that one is growing in? And it seems to have the characteristics of a natural theology, or some God, or beauty, or mystery, or unknown. The source of the quality that you feel like you're growing in is an apophatic quality. It's something you sense, but you can't put to words, but you know it when you feel it. Well, why should you even trust in that, though, if the entire culture is saying that's subjective and dumb, right? So then, if that's the signals of the society, you can't trust in the signal of the growing in the good life that you have to pursue it, to then prove capable to handle pluralism or politics or democracy or yourself, right? So all of the cultural incentives are training us against the ability to sense the field in which we are growing in the good life, which is connected to a kind of apophatic coming forth of a partial object that is beauty, the apophatic. And if we do not trust in that, then we cannot develop to even begin approaching the possibility of democracy and pluralism, the possibility of global connections and new forms of economics, or environmentalism that isn't ultimately reduced to the problem is humanity, remove humanity, the environment will be great, right? No, what would it look like to steward environmentalism, right? Like Einstein or Tyson would say, right? Well, if you steward the environment, you're looking for a quality of experience. You want the relationship between man and nature to have a certain what? Quality. But you've been trained your entire life that you can't trust your assessment of quality. Well, then environmentalism is doomed. Politics is doomed. If human beings cannot trust or continue to devalue their ability to discern quality, there is no field that humans are involved with, no institution, no world, no subject that humans are involved with that cannot ultimately require the erasure of the human being, because the human is essentially a qualitative being, not a quantitative being. And if quality is not allowed in our world, then the human is not allowed. And that has to change, or we'll just continue to have the replacement of humanity versus our extension. But let me pass it to Michael and then Jacob. Michael, please.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something you said, Daniel, a while ago about laws and how laws can get co-opted by institutions and, essentially through like this forced coercion might actually teach resistance more so than teach social coordination on a large scale. And it made me think about how, back to what Michelle was talking about with these kind of micro habitual changes and that spreading and eventually scaling, that it's, in my experience personally and the people that I've observed, the people who make the most substantial changes in habit, regardless of how small it might be, but like if we're just looking at like over duration of time, like consistency and growing into habit, the people who are able to do that are the people who were inspired rather than coerced into it. Like it was people who either there was a role model that they saw who was living a certain way, or they went through a transformative experience themselves, which tapped them into a deeper version of themselves. Like that's it. It's it's a drawing out, right? It's a drawing out into the possibility. And then that sets you on a course where you haven't clearly defined what the extent to which that habit could continue to evolve is essentially infinite, because it's like it's up to you. Like you're the captain of your own ship. It's not like you're being force-fed some idea of something. And I was just thinking on a walk this morning that I was on, just thinking about this call, and I was just thinking about like how, I mean, all of you that I've met in the net have been inspirations in one way or another for me. But I was just thinking particularly about Daniel and Michelle, and like, they live on this farm and they have this wedding venue and they write together and they host these things together and their children are probably amazing. Like there's a way in which I've been drawn out by just experiencing your energy, your field, to use Jacob's term. And that's like, I think that's how like all of like habit change like ought to develop, is like it's and that's why I think these small changes on an individual or like a family or a small community level are so important, because if a child can see the way that their dad or mom or uncle or mentor teacher goes about living and thinks about things, like that can leave a huge impression on that person. And that can honestly make up for a lack of that elsewhere. Like, for me in my life, it's like there's been a handful of people that have just left such an impression on me that I can go through the world, days, weeks, months, years without speaking to them and hardly encountering virtuosity in the world sometimes. But it's like an anchor. It's like an anchor of like a vision of what I could be, what the world could look like. And I think activism, I think what activism should be grounded in is leading by example as opposed to leading by uh, forced norms or something. I mean, norms are important, like especially if you're trying to coordinate a community or a movement or even a family, right? But like there should be flexibility to adapt and to evolve that, I think. So that was one thing that I wanted to say. And yeah, I think the last thing, just on kind of the good life and it being grown into, is kind of connected to my earlier point of like that's it's a lifelong, it's a process. It's a process, and it's not a fixed doctrine. And I remember there was a point that I got to like a couple of years ago. I was, reading a lot of philosophy and doing a lot of therapy, and I got to this point where I was like, oh shit, like I feel like I like know what it means to live a good life, or at least I know like this compilation, this amalgamation of all these like great thinkers throughout time, like what's next? And I was like, okay, well, what's next is, because I had this like moment of crisis where I was what what's the point of me even um not like what's the point of me living, but like am I through my life going to come up with anything that these people haven't figured out? What's the point of writing if I can read William Blake and be like, holy shit, like how did someone even write these things? And I think the way that I got out of that was like there's still meaning in each individual person finding out for themselves what other people have already found out. Like that there's still so much worthwhile in doing that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm really getting emotional right now, so I'm gonna I'm gonna throw it right back to you.
No, that was magnificent and very kind what you said, my friend. And we lost Jacob. If he comes back, I'll throw it to him. And no, I think so there's a few things. First, I think what you said on inspiration is spot on. And Mr. Luba, good to see you. Mr. Rivera, good to see you. If you feel this, is that like there's a real sense in which when there's almost a way in which when philosophers talked about the good life, there is a way in which that language, I think, is not the best description or metaphor, because you overly associate the good life with the moral life or stuff like that. It's more like the inspired life. It's more like the beautiful life. It's more like stuff like that, right? Like, and by good life, they mean that. But there's a way in which over time, the good life, the word good is too easy to conflate with preference and like. How do you get the like that is the good life becomes how do you get the life that is your preference, right? Now that's not what they meant. They'd be like, no, the good life ain't up to you. It is the good life whether you like it or not. And so like the good life is like the inspired life. So when we call it the good life, it's really more like the inspired life. And I'll give it to Jacob and then Mr. Luber. And that I think is helpful, because when you get that, it's like, oh, I got all the money, I got everything, but am I inspired? You see, here's the funny thing. If you were inspired, you wouldn't even be asking that. Like, it's like if you're inspired, can you imagine asking, is this it? Like, no one who is inspired asks, is this it? Right? Like, I can imagine asking, is this it if you had a good life? I can imagine asking, is this it if you had a successful life? I can imagine you asking, is this it even if you have a meaningful life, or you think the universe is great, or everything is cool. I cannot imagine you saying, is this it when you're inspired, or when you're captivated by the beautiful, or when you feel like you're growing into something, right? So that language of inspiration, I think, has a powerful thrust to it. And yeah, I think models change the world. I think basically, again, for most of history, you just had to be lucky to be around a model, because there wasn't an effective social coordination mechanism for models, or to see models, or to have models. Like, I cannot fathom my life without meeting you fine people. Like, and here's the horror of it. I wouldn't know what I was missing. Like, that's always the Kierkegaard point. If you're missing something, you don't know what you're missing, right? Like, the ways that the liminal web, if we opens horizons of possibility, is so radically unbelievable that it's easy to lose sight of. But once you stop seeing it as merely like this, like it's not merely content creation, but participating in the conversation. We lost Jacob again. I was going to throw it to him. Like that, like it's not content creation. It's keeping the conversation going. It's keeping the modeling. It's keeping the inspiration. It's keeping the growing, right? That is a very, very, very different infrastructure that radically changes things. And you, like, again, the quality of learning, the quality of horizons opening, the kinds of people you can meet because of this technology is utterly profound. And it can deal with some of the social coordination dilemmas and game theory dynamics that we've had for most of history that have led to Nash equilibria, because because the only way to effectively work globally was at a large scale, which then is captured by institutional logic, like Marcise Olsen, Jonathan Rauch, right? Well, then how else? Well, crap. Doesn't that mean the only way to be global is to fall into institutional logic? Well, yeah, for most of history, and it becomes pathological and logic of capital and flattening and all that stuff. But now things can change, I think. And we have to lean into that. And I think activism of example is quite powerful. I'll let me pass it, because Kishere's coming back. I'll throw it to him and then give it to Mr. Luber. The internet is a funny thing. But indeed, I think the good life is the inspired life, and I think there's something powerful about the activism of example and the planting of roots and creating like you know how you tend a garden, and then I'll give it to Jacob here. It's like tending the field, like we're tending the garden, right? I love what Ross Bird was saying, and I think this is true. How often the Christian emphasizes the throwing of seeds, but Jesus in many of the parables is emphasizing the tilling of the soil. And the tilling of the soil is almost way more important than the seeds, because if the soil isn't tilled and you throw a seed, it all dies, right? Like, we haven't had an effective technology to till the social soil, right? So, yeah, bad stuff has grown. Like, this is the work of tilling a social soil that makes it possible for things to grow that otherwise couldn't. But let me give it to Jacob and then Mr. Luber. Jacob Kishere, it is good to see you, sir. Let me throw it to you. It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to just come in with the general sentiments that were flowing with me, coming off the back of what Michael was saying, which was absolutely excellent. I really liked that. Yeah, I think insofar as conversation can draw us back towards personal inspiration and inspiration by other persons, we'll be in pretty good standing. I think that's that's foundationally kind of a healthy thing for the most part. I mean, obviously, philosophers here, there's always a way that it can go wrong, right? But generally speaking, it's very good to have. What am I sensing into here? Yeah. I think there's something about the non-linear tilling of the soil, of the psyche, or of the soul, and of the development of the soul as being a process that is not easily quantifiable, is not easily certifiable, but is qualitatively observable for the person who is in the process of developing it. And whilst your fortunes in the world may well go up and down, as you know they did in the lives of many famous authors and so on, the soulfulness, the degree to which those ups and downs are more fully experienced, could be something that has a kind of, you can kind of feel that it's qualitatively developing, right? And this gets into something I actually was taken by my friend Matthew to see a talk by a spiritual teacher here in London called Patrick Connor, I believe. And it was fascinating because, from my understanding, he has no connection with the web conversation, but much of what he was saying was in deep resonance with ideas that have been, at play here. For example, he was talking about, what if the internet could be animated by a magical web? And I thought, ooh, that's very close to the liminal web, what he's talking about there, like a magical web. And there was something that he was speaking to around scale. And I know that scale is something come up here many, many times. And he was transmitting a message to the effect that the problem of scale is different when we're dealing in something qualitative than when we're dealing in a generally quantitative context. And scale is often has the connotation of quantitative scale. All right, we've got something good here. How do we scale it up? How do we get the numbers? Da 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 da. He was speaking a lot about vibration, living in a vibrational universe, and that on some essential level, this kind of development of soul is a vibrational quality. It's a vibrational transmission. And the idea was that insofar as you had a small number of people vibrating at a, I don't know if you want to say high or deep, right? At the right frequency, that would actually be able to scale and impact in culture in a way that's non-linear or quantum in some way. And that was a really fascinating idea for me. And I think that's a really fascinating spirit to bring to the liminal web. I think in the context of my own life, it's also very, very in alignment with the idea that you cannot go around assuming which of your actions are going to be the impactful ones or not, which of them are the important ones, which encounters are important, especially by the measure of certain societal standards. And this is often part of the kind of the weird sort of two-faced reality of blue church world, of institutional life, of politics and media, is somebody will have an appearance, who they show up as when they go on air, and then who they show up as off air is different. And then there's also this whole kind of field effect that starts to take place of like, oh, we get in a room at a networking event or something, and it's like, who's important and who's not important, and how you navigate something even as simple as just like a conference, an academic conference. That's a deeply spiritual and vibrational question, properly approached. And I would contend that being in that deep vibrational alignment. Being in the liminality is potentially going to mean that you have interactions that you don't even know like why you're having it or what it's going to lead to, or if this might seem like totally unimportant, but lo and behold, and I'm speaking from experience now because I was at a conference and talked with a really random like young dude who, you know, I had no reason to believe that this guy was going to be like the influential or impactful or well-connected person. I literally just had like I kind of get like I could have played video games with this guy when I was 15 vibe. But for whatever reason, I felt like chatting with him, and I did. And then like he just reveals like, oh, he's at the conference because his best friend is doing work with bringing psychedelics to churches in Canada and bringing that conversation to churches, which is like super, super niche and super connected with one of my core projects right now. And he also turned out to be doing conscious rap at a level like you never would have thought based on his aesthetic and experience that this guy was spitting. Like when I got his SoundCloud, I was really surprised. So all of that is to say, you know, not knowing, flowing with not knowing, and a kind of vibrational participation seems to be, you know, a different way of playing the board, and a key understanding for the liminal web, magical web, and more to come on that.
Magnificent, and it's actually perfect. I'll give it to Luber. It's actually really aligned with some of the stuff that was coming. Well, first off, that was magnificent, and I think like this emphasis on the qualitative, right, and this trust in the qualitative, and also knowing like if fields are not really quantitative. This is what's weird, and not to get into the weeds or suggest a massive expertise in physics. Fields are not things you quantify so much as they're qualitatively experienced, and the quality of the experience changes the manifestation of the field, but this would mean quality is more fundamental than quantity, right? Like, and in fact, there is something at the most fundamental level of reality that is qualitative before it's quantitative, right? We have been taught to believe the quantitative is more real than the qualitative. Well, that may not be the case if fields are actually primary, right? Another example, the great example Leibniz gives, where he's critiquing the idea that you can have autonomous algebra without geometry, is the way I would describe it is he would ask, how do you count something? How do you count? You go, well, that's obvious, freaking, you know, Leibniz. I say 1 apple, 2 apples, 3 apples. He's like, oh, wait, pause. How'd you get to the number 3? There was a shared quality, so you counted 3 of the quality. Counting is not quantitative. Counting is only possible because there's a quality you're counting. Leibniz is basically saying all quantification is only intelligible if there is a pre-quality first. Otherwise, you're listing. You're not counting. You would say 1 apple, 1 bookshelf, 1, like it's a list. What's the difference between a list and counting? Quality. Listing is fragmentation and it is unintelligible. And if it is intelligible, it's because there's a quality. You say, oh, you said bookshelf and wall and house and fruit because it's all in a house. Oh, you made it intelligible by what? Not in reference to a quantity, but in reference to a shared quality. This is the radical move Leibniz makes that I don't, that's why like I think it's really important that Leibniz starts with the analysis of citas, or you think he's making when Leibniz is saying all of reality is relationships, not causes, it is not a quantifiable statement, it's a qualitative statement. Everything is a relation in terms of quality. Nothing relates quantitatively. That's the key point. There's no such thing as a quantitative there is no such thing as a quantitative relationship. It can't. Numbers don't relate. You list. Like if something relates, it is a quality, right? It has to be. And so that's what Leibniz is saying, because if you count to 3, the only way you count to 3 is because you're counting a shared quality. And that's fantastic with Aristotle. Leibniz loves Aristotle. So the reason why this is important is all intelligibility is qualitative ultimately, and we've lost Luber, dang it. And so likewise, the field is fundamentally qualitative. The next move is if Stu Kaufman is correct, and I am quite convinced that Mr. Kaufman's cosmology deals with the crisis in physics, where non-locality is fundamental. It's because it's raining here, I think. The freaking rain in Virginia destroys everything, Mr. Jockin. Is that non-locality is in quantum mechanics, where two particles beyond the speed of light interact, which should be impossible if the speed of light is the fastest thing in the world, right? So what Stu Kaufman argues is that non-locality is fundamental, not locality, and actually it explains impossible universes, all sorts of things. Also, it feeds with Terence Deacon making lack the creation of entropy and order. Why do I say this? Non-locality cannot be quantified. Non-locality is quality of interaction. It means at the basis of the universe is quality before quantity, right? What it means is that all sequence of particles following other particles starts with a non-local foundation, which is a fundamental quality, which means everything is interconnected beyond the speed of light. Interconnectedness is more fundamental than the speed of light. The speed of relationship is faster than light in a very weird way. That's what we see on the quantum level, right? Okay, so intelligibility requires quality to come first. The universe seems to have a qualitative dimension, and fields are fundamentally qualitative, right? Well, if all that's true, because I know you were talking about Sheldrick, who's basically like, hey, look at morphic resonance. Someone does a freaking word puzzle on, a lot of people do word puzzles, and then 2 weeks later, everyone's able to do the word puzzle better. And then you have the dogs and all those different examples. Well, if Stu Kaufman is correct about non-locality being fundamental, then what Sheldrick is saying would make a whole lot of sense. Because, yeah, everything has a mysterious creative relationship that is not reducible to causation. Causation describes locality. Fields and high order interaction describes non-locality. And the issue is locality, which is the speed of light, and matter is built upon non-locality. So they're all mixed up in mysterious ways, but both logics are in operations at all times, right? But here's the trick. By definition, the way they're mixed up cannot be quantified. Because if you could quantify it, you'd be reducing the non-local into the local. So it has to be a qualitative mixed up. So when religions are like, hey man, praying seems to really matter, and the scientist is like, well, let's study it. No, because that by definition is assuming the non-local can be brought into the local without reducing the logic of how prayer operates, or mysticism, or beauty, or all of these different things, right? Like there's a long tradition of many theologies basically suggesting that there is mysterious cause and effect in operation. Things that you cannot reduce to qualitative interaction, right? And yet quantitative interaction, and yet there is a quality of human being in the world that when carried in a certain way has a higher probability of encountering the beautiful, to encountering the coincidental, to encountering the providential, to encountering things open up that otherwise could not occur, and it would be foolish to say otherwise. And then the scientist comes along and says, we'll prove it. But the scientist is assuming that what is a fundamental qualitative reality can be brought into the local quantitative and not remove what that fundamental reality is, which is a presupposition that may not be true. And actually, if Stuart Kaufman is correct, it's not true. And basically, the only way to deal with the great crisis in physics right now is to make non-locality fundamental. So suddenly stuff like Sheldrick is saying is not insane, right? What Sheldrick is saying is kind of sounds insane if you assume locality and the speed of light is most fundamental reality. But if non-locality is most fundamental reality, that means field is most real, and it would make quality most real. Oh, and by the way, phenomenologically, we have lots of evidence in human experience that quality is most real. Well, okay, phenomenological experience is not proof, but if you have phenomenological experience that quality is most real, and now we have a cosmology that makes non-locality most fundamental that deals with the crisis of physics, and all we got to do is basically mean everything has a very odd interconnectability like particles do on the quantum level of non-locality, where one particle across the universe moves right and on the other side beyond the speed of light it moves left. Make that spooky activity, as Einstein called it. Make that fundamental. Oh, well then yeah, maybe people doing word puzzles on the other side of the world can increase the likelihood that people on the other side can be good at those word puzzles, because non-locality is fundamental. So particles acting on one side of the world that have no clear local signal to another can still nevertheless have an interaction. A cosmos where non-locality is fundamental is one where you can actually be having these mysterious cause and effects in operation and it not be nuts. And then the ability to sense that I should talk to this person. I can't explain why, but I sense that I should talk to this person. Yeah, there could be the possibility of interaction that cannot be brought into local understanding because non-locality is most real. Fields are most real, right? All of that would follow from Stu Kaufman. Stu Kaufman to Terence Deacon leads you into a world of fields as realities, which then means basically, yeah, just being on the liminal web stewards and tills the social field or the human field to open conditions of possibility that otherwise would not be there, because the mere doing of it adds to the field possibilities that increase the probability that people stumble onto ideas and thoughts they otherwise would not have, that then changes the social sphere, right? So yeah, I think that's all. Like, people have these experiences, and then I'll give it to Michael. People have these experiences like, I don't know why I should talk to you, and yet I feel I should. And then you're my twin. That's weird. You're my twin. I don't know why. How did that happen? Or we've all had this experience. You look at a book and you go, I should read that. And it turns out to be the perfect book you needed at this perfect moment. That's weird. It's been on your shelf for 5 years. You've always looked at it, but you've never felt that pull to read it. And then suddenly you do. That's weird. Or you stumble into a conversation and they just happen to be talking about the same stuff that you're talking about. That's weird. Well, it's all crazy, guys. I know you're assessing a quality of connectiveness, but quality doesn't count and it's not real. So no. No, what if quality is real? What if the most real thing is that feeling of coincidence? Because the most fundamental feature of reality is non-locality, fields, and connections that cannot be quantified, because otherwise we can't deal with the problems of cosmology today, right? And then the liminal web is participating in a mysterious way in that creative possibility that opens conditions for people to stumble into that otherwise they would not stumble into. So it's not crazy to me, but let me give it to Michael.
Yeah, this is so great. Speaking of stumbling into, random relationships, and I'll bring it back to what we're talking about, but my former neighbor gave me his first book that he wrote, and he had written it about Alexander the Great and connecting like his military conquest to like business strategies in the modern day. And he literally just stumbled upon this book, this biography of Alexander the Great in a library, and was so captivated by like his ability to adapt to the situation. And I won't go into it, but I ended up helping him write research now 2 chapters of his new book, which is kind of demystifying the world's greatest scientific inventions, and kind of like telling the story that not many people know. And he's doing 1 chapter on Newton's discovery of gravity. And it was really interesting to read, a lot of like the primary source documents of, I can't remember the title of the works now, but kind of where he details his like first theory of gravity. And then now, Leibniz is coming up so much, like the whole kind of really kind of silly feud that they had, where they both basically discovered the same thing at the same time. And then, Newton was kind of strongmanning Leibniz, like basically kind of trying to discredit like all of his discoveries and kind of trying to take sole ownership of it. But, like as the story goes, Newton's like in a pandemic, right? It was a pandemic at that time, and like he's, at his house and he's outside in the backyard and he sees the apple fall from the tree, and he's like, huh, like how does that happen? And like I don't claim to have really a grasp on physics whatsoever, but like I mean, it kind of seems silly that he was so wary of metaphysics when he really kind of put a name to like this field that exists in, you know, all of reality that like no one can see, is invisible. Like it's purely quality. Like you can't quantify. I mean, you can quantify like the speed at which something moves through gravity, 9.8 meters per second, but like gravity itself, like all the other forces in the universe, you can't quantify. So it's like quality all the way down, and like it's just so obvious that quality is primary to the universe. Like, you know, yeah, I mean, you can't have quantity without quality. And then I was thinking, you know, when you were talking about kind of how we've conflated quantity with quality and how we pursue quantity, like I think so many people are well-intentioned trying to pursue a life of quality, but they just go about it through the wrong means. Like they try and achieve quality by amassing quantity. Like, you know, you I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but um like there's just I think there's just like a modal confusion between like how to actually achieve a life of quality and do it, yeah, like do it in a way that like you retain a level of clarity and consciousness and reason and virtue um through it all. And yeah, I guess it was one last thing that I wanted to add, which is kind of about this uh point that Jockin made a while ago about the story of Abraham killing his son and how he was in pain through that, and how that's like, you know, when we think about like the good life, right? Like it's not just it's not just you know, I think there can sometimes on the liminal web, although I don't think often, but like there can be kind of this focus on like kind of the very like juicy positive aspects of a life of meaning and connectedness and community and all these things. And like the good life also has to include the pain and the suffering. It's like I think you said at one point this call, Daniel, it's like it's or might have been Jacob, like an experience of the peaks and the valleys, like a more intense experience of both of them, like a real appreciation of both of them. And I'm in this poetry group right now, and last week we read, or sorry, this week we're reading Melville, which I didn't even know that he wrote poetry. And he wrote all these poems about, he lived through the Civil War, and he wrote all these poems about like during the Civil War, about Civil War battles. And so this one is titled Shiloh, or a Requiem, and there's this one line that just fucking like threw me for a loop. Of dying foemen mingled there, foemen at morn, but friends at eve. Fame or country least their care, what like a bullet can undeceive. Like that last line, like what like a bullet can undeceive, is so fucking like it's so insane to read and to just think about, like, you know, when you're on the doorsteps of death, like how little these divisions mean, you know, and I think that is like, I think that kind of points to like the point of like really experiencing suffering, is that makes you, it contextualizes your life, and it makes you realize how little importance so many of the things that you think are important actually are. And it's a profound experience of quality. And all the quantity, you know, all the they're on this side, I'm on this side, we're soldiers pitted against each other in war. It's like it just doesn't matter anymore. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
That's a freaking good line. Oh my gosh. That's insane. No, Melville's something. That was wonderful. And if anyone has final things, please. I think we lost Lubric. Dang it. I think so. There's a few things. You know, Newton did a lot in astrology. He did a lot in mysticism and different things. But one of the things that the gentleman who did the knowledge machine talks about, and I think he's correct, is that when Newton did physics, he just did physics. Didn't do anything else. He only thought about physics. And he probably also was influenced by the theological tradition that has the idea that all truth is God's truth. So if you can do physics just as physics, and the results will point to theology, it will point to God, it will have universal ramifications because all truth is God's truth. But he had this radical kind of focus, which, doesn't necessarily lead to becoming anti-metaphysical or anything, right? I think what happens in science is the question becomes, okay, how do you give authority to your results, right? Like you say, hey, I got a theory, or you're Einstein, you say, I got general relativity. Well, how do you give your results authority? Well, there's basically one way science has done it: prediction. We're going to predict something, and it will be something you can quantify. But prediction is how you deal with the authority and legitimization problem, right? But the problem is that isn't referenced necessarily to a quantitative assessment. We can quantify it, right? Which then gradually leads you to associating the predictable and the quantifiable with the authoritative. But hey, in a world where people don't have the ability to assess quality, that's what you got to do, right? Like, what else can you do to establish authority if people don't have the training according to a social coordination mechanism or field by which to give quality authority? You end up having to give authority to prediction and experimentation, right? But ultimately, I think that has to be a stepping stone to authority based on quality. And I think we're seeing that with the crisis in science of the replication crisis. Prediction can only do so much. You cannot predict complexity. Like any field of complexity, like society, like economics, like anything that are the deepest human realities, prediction sucks. It can only do so much. Like, to accurately predict, it has to be minuscule, right? It has to be really, really small and not be in a complexity system like Jim Rudd or whatever we'll talk about, right? But of course, that means in order to have effective prediction, you have to engage in reductionism, and only the reduced has authority, and only that is therefore real. Now, of course, there's all sorts of problematic metaphysical conflations in that, but you have no defense to that logic if you're not able to give quality authority. If you can give quality authority, you have an alternative logic to avoid the Nash equilibria. But if you don't have quality, and I'll give it to Jockin here, you have to follow good to see you, Michael, and I'll be closing in a minute as well because of work. But you have to give authority to prediction, which then means you associate prediction and the quantifiable with the authoritative. And then you get trained into only associating the quantitative with the authoritative. And you then try to apply that heuristic to everything, even when it doesn't work. And it doesn't work when you come to complex systems like economics or a life. When you deal with complex systems, the only way to accurately assess them or usefully assess them is in terms of quality, which we've been trained not to think as authority. So we cannot assess complex systems in a manner that can have any relevance to what the system actually is, let alone work it toward quality. So I think the authority problem contributed to this mistake that even scientists like Gödel was a Platonist, like Telsa was mystical, like there was lots of mysticism. So how is it that science went in this direction of autonomous quantification? I think it's because of the needing to give authority to your results, which makes you based on prediction, and the prediction gives you the authority, but then you overfit what you can predict, and prediction as a heuristic is useless in complex systems. And then that's exactly why you have what? What's the crisis now? The legitimization crisis that Habermas taught. The colleges can't predict anything. The social sciences are wrong. All of them are wrong in their predictions, which then we go, well, that proves the field is useless, or that we can't trust the experts. Well, there's a real value in expertise, but you see, if the only metric of judging authority is prediction, then when the experts can't predict something, which they can't do necessarily in a complex system, you must conclude that the experts aren't wrong, and then you overfit that and say expertise is bad. There's no rule for knowledge. So we have overfit prediction as the basis of authority to the destruction of all of the fields dealing with complexity, because their authority comes from qualitative assessment, which we're not capable of thinking. So this mistake of overfitting the predictive heuristic has caused the institution and legitimization crisis, or been a major factor of it, in addition to institutional incentives for wealth and status and all that other crap. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
We got to end with some controversy. I challenge this. I have rebuttals at this point. Okay, so I'll agree with you on this point. I think what you're saying, when it's autonomous prediction, basically when knowledge and authority is autonomous knowing, right? Via, as we said before, we've said this in conversations, where knowledge has to be depersonalized, that the individual subject in question has to be either converted to a fungible, interchangeable unit, or completely removed by a mathematical formula, and demonstration being the highest standard of knowledge. So I agree with you about that. That's a big problem, because it's basically I agree with that. But here's the thing. The issue with prediction is when there's I want to intervene with another part. There's the peer review mechanism. Because in theory, what's supposed to happen is a field gets a bunch of it builds models. Those models can then be tested. You make predictions based on those models. When there's an error, what's supposed to happen is, hey guys, we applied the model to this phenomenon. It's not mapping, guys. It ain't working. We have to, looks like we have to consider other variables, which, by the way, is the biggest distinction of expertise, right? Versus what we're talking about, is that experts, they don't even know what they're weighing. Like when they're taking in all the phenomenon to come to their assessment and prediction and acting, they don't even necessarily always know exactly what they're weighing, because it's complicated, because it's just from memory and from training and from experience. All these things aggregate together to create a weird weighing mechanism that is not a formula. It's not exactly something you can just spat out into a linear regressional model and then use that to make a prediction. So when you try to do that, though, just via dimension reduction, you're going to have to do it. What's supposed to happen is when there's an error, I go back to that first, the issue I think is peer review. When there's an error, you're supposed to be, hey guys, we're missing something. Looks like one of our parameters are wrong. We're missing something here. No, shut it. It's against the model. It's against the normal traditional account. We're not going to even let this paper come to exist, or we're not going to let this paper exist to even come out, let alone show, or even when we know systematically those patterns exist. So, for example, literacy we've had this problem with literacy for 50, 60 years now. That's much has been recorded in literacy training. But when people try to present, hey guys, maybe the account we're talking about isn't the right one. Maybe something else. Nope. Stamp it. Don't even talk about it. Nope. We can't do it. That's the danger. And that's the problem. It's actually, Daniel, you're gigantic, like quasi, rather amazing, entertaining, but very legitimate screed about the political process on that kind of late night net, that kind of 7 p.m. one. No, you're literally legitimate. You're really reasonable to say why you were so animated about it, because when you clamp down on other people's reality of like, hey guys, something's really wrong here. Something's like not fitted. Your model you're presenting to me is not mapping. It's not applying to the phenomenon I'm experiencing. We got ourselves some problems here. First of all, you're not in truth. You're in error, and you're not responding to the error. You're just like, no. And we're going to double down that our model is correct and self-justify and retroactively justify the model to explain why it doesn't work. We're getting to epicycles. It's basically epicycles all over again. So I just want to intervene. I always want to intervene a little bit on that part, is that it's not that prediction is not a valid mode of demonstration, right? It's not that it's not true. In fact, I'm reading Hippocrates right now from my health class, and he says point blank, the best way to persuade, actually on his exact point, the best way to persuade someone to take you seriously in the medical arts is to be able to predict the when, the how, and how much, and at what time. So it's this kind of a condition. So you can look at a condition sign and then say in 3 days X will happen, as an example. So that's not the problem. So I don't know if it's not necessarily the issue of prediction. It's one of our more reliable methods of demonstration. However, the problem is when you're wrong in your prediction and then you double down and you have mechanisms that actually systematically shut down the correction process, when, especially when a prediction is not from an expert, but from someone who's just using a model, then we have even more problems because they have dimension reduction built into it. So that's where we won't guarantee there's going to be an error that an expert may not have necessarily, or at least have less likely so. Just want to intervene on that challenge, on that one part.
No, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. Prediction, the language I always use is overfit, underfit, like in computer science, right? Like prediction, the problem is overfitting prediction, which you're tempted to do because it works so well, right? Like you wouldn't overfit something that didn't work. You tend to over-apply something that works. And then, of course, when it doesn't work, you double down on it like you described, because what else do you have? And you would be scared to explore something else, right? So the danger, humans tend to be threatened often more by the things that work than by the things that don't work, because they get overly invested in the things they work, then they overfit them, and you get all sorts of problems, right? Like the issue is, the more you approach, I guess I could say, a three-body problem, the more prediction isn't going to work, right? So prediction is amazing down here, but the more you are heading towards various three-body problems, prediction isn't going to work. But you don't even, here's what ends up happening. Rather than admit prediction doesn't work, why not just pretend like it's not a three-body problem? No, economics isn't a three-body problem. Society isn't a three-body problem. It's just we don't have enough information yet, or people are wrong, right? Like that's what ends up happening. Like the trick to having prediction, in my opinion, what happens in fields is you simply claim sociology is not a three-body problem. Then we can make a prediction science about it, and I don't have to start exploring a world where quality is fundamental, or exploring different epistemologies of thinking. I don't want to do that because everyone at the institution is able to predict things, and I don't want to be the black sheep and lose my job, and I don't want to be seen as the guy out. Institutional incentives then make you call things not three-body problems that are, and as a result, you then get lots of trouble that starts occurring, right? Like for me, basically, economics is a three-body problem, if you're really looking at it seriously. Sociology is a three-body problem. Politics is a three-body problem. Law is a three-body problem. It is something that is a complex system that therefore is not predictable in its first, second, or third order effects, like Thomas Sowell will talk about in applied economics, right? Science is incredibly useful precisely because it is based on constant testing and prediction. The problem is there is institutional and social incentive to deny the existence of three-body problems to extend the reign of science, if you will, right? Like there's an incentive simply to give yourself more power to claim that sociology is not a three-body problem, or economics is not a complex system, because then your power can extend into that domain and you don't have to limit it, right? But in that act, you know, what does Alex Ebert say? Where there's not limit, you become cancerous. It becomes totalitarian. It becomes oppressive, right? So the denial of three-body problems or complex systems, there is an incentive to do that precisely so that you can expand the realm in which your power of science and prediction can spread into, and you know, convince yourself you're not overfitting or going outside your domain, right? Like you want to be able to convince yourself you're not going beyond your proper bound, right? Well, you'd simply do that by denying fields as being complex, right? Because if they're not complex, by that I mean the Redian complexity or complex science, well, then you're not overfitting prediction, right? So certainly when dealing with non-three-body problems, if you will, non-complex systems, prediction is incredibly important. And in fact, there is something to be said about seeing science as having a unique power in that testing and rigor and minute details, as you know, oh, I lost his name. You know, that emphasize that science is like this boring gathering of all these small minute details, right? So there's a real kind of like, nobility in being willing to gather these minute, boring details in order to find some sort of reliable, predictable system, right? And that should be honored and seen as a thankless work. Who wants to be in the laboratory to do this experiment for the 500th time that's kind of boring so that you can get to 5 sigma or whatever and then have a reliable prediction? No one, but there are people who are willing to do that boring custodial work that then gives us predictable information we otherwise couldn't have. So there's a nobility in that. But there's likewise a nobility in maintaining a church that, say, takes care of the homeless and the poor and different things, but then that very church can extend into cancerous forms that then lead to corrupt religion, right? So it's like every form has at its core a potential noble version of it if it doesn't overfit or if it doesn't underfit. But here's the problem. How do you determine when something is overfitting versus underfitting? Well, you have to judge quality. There's like, you cannot, so let me put it this way. You know how very often now you'll hear in conversations, and I do think this is, and then I'll bring it to a close unless anyone has final things to say. I've really enjoyed this. It's wonderful. Kishere, you're beautiful. Basically, and then I'll give it to you. And like conversations today, very often you'll hear people say, it's not either or. You need to have justice, but also freedom. You know, that doesn't mean you'll hear a lot of caveat, right? Like an understanding of a need for bothness, right? There's kind of an upgrade of the baseline now, where people more and more, even on like a very conservative talk show, they'll even say, well, we need a little bit of government, but not too much government. And you'll have liberals saying, we need freedom, just not at the expense of minorities. Like there's a way that people talk now that is constantly acknowledging some degree of the need for the other side, right? Like Hegel would say it's dialectical, but it's a kind of like sense that everyone has some good that we need to acknowledge. Well, here's the problem. That's the mean. You were mentioning that last night, Jockin, with Aristotle, which isn't the middle, but the fitting amount of a certain proportionality relative to the situation. The only way to assess bothness that meets the mean or fittedness is quality. It's a quality judgment. You cannot quantify the mean. The mean is always relative to the situation. Maybe in this situation, the breakdown between freedom and justice is 70-30, but in another situation, it's 30-50. How do you, well, that's not it, 30-70 or 50-50, right? You cannot quantify it. You have to assess it, determining, the only way to determine if you've actually found the mean must be a qualitative experience, right? So more and more people are subconsciously kind of speaking as if they have a sense that it all comes down to a qualitative assessment that is necessarily particular and necessarily situational. Like you're just hearing that in how people talk now. The very fact that they're saying it's not, you know, we need both. Well, you need both. It's either. Now you can't do too much side. You get, like there's this language that people talk that is an acknowledgement of a needing of bothness. That is a subconscious assent to the ultimate necessity of a qualitative assessment. It has to be, because you cannot quantify bothness that is not 50-50, but a mean of fittedness for a situation. So I think right there, that suggests there is increasingly a kind of epistemological evolution, if you will, that is occurring where people sense in the field the need for the multiplicity, for the bothness. But if you sense that, the only way to deal with that problem is a qualitative judgment, is a qualitative assessment. And so quality becomes fundamental, but we're then pathological because we've been trained that the only way to think is prediction-based or model-based, and you cannot model this ahead of the situation, only assess it in the movement of the field in the situation. Quality cannot be assessed ahead of time. Quality is basically temporal. Quality is fundamentally the unfolding of time as a creative evolution, to use Bergson's language, or to be, time is quality in this kind of Whiteheadian sense. Like, and so you only know it in the situation, which must be actively assessed live, time and time and time and time again. But that doesn't mean it's relative. That means it's conditional, and you have to have the skill to judge the quality of the condition. So it's not relative and random. It's very fitted, but you're the agent that determines the non-random fittedness situation by situation, which is only possible if you have the skill to sense quality or sense the field or feel the situation. If you do not have that ability, then you cannot deal with this problem of bothness. You cannot deal with figuring out the mean from situation to situation. And if that's what everyone under pluralism is increasingly subconsciously suggesting in how they talk, well, this is the capacity as Dall needed, thus a space where we can train that and add it to the social field and so forth. But Jacob Kishere, please.
Well, very well put as always. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight something that was really screaming out for me in your observations around quantitative authority structures, and that is that all of these structures have egos. These motherfuckers have a lot of egos. There's a lot of egos in all of these institutions and personalities and psychologies, and that is just so important to take into account. And the more that you have a populace, or at least a space within the populace that's well tuned to personality and who's bullshitting and what's ego and those kinds of things, that has a very positive mediating effect on being able to perceive and sense and bring that into awareness in relation to these quantitative institutional claims.
Oh no, I think that's exactly right. Well, I think it is not. I think it is to. It kind of makes sense that an overly quantitative world creates ego, because I think quality is necessarily relational, where quantity creates the sense that you can understand reality by yourself, non-contingently in the abstract. I don't need others. I just need the number two. I just need a model. I don't need people. I just need models. So in the funny thing, where you say that subjectivity doesn't matter, you end up with egotism. You would think it'd be the opposite. If we say subjectivity doesn't matter, shouldn't we get rid of egotism? No. When you say subjectivity doesn't matter, you lock everyone in themselves. And so you get egotism. So it is precisely when you acknowledge that subjectivity is real, which sounds like it would make egotism worse, that's actually when egotism can be open to the other subjectivity and relations become fundamental. So the discrediting of subjectivity, which many people have argued is humbling and it helps us move out of egotism and removes man from the center of the universe, which is a good thing, is actually the ultra multiplier of egotism, because you lock everyone within themselves. And so then a world of quantification, which would sound like would remove the problem of the ego, actually makes it 1,000 times worse, because relations aren't real. But if relations are real, then egotism makes no sense. And in fact, if relations are real and you have an ego, you're in privation. If relationships are most real, then the only way to have substance is to engage in relationship. And if you're engaged in egotism, you're engaged in, well, privation, which is the loss of substance, right? But if subjectivity doesn't exist, then the more you deny the existence of the other, you're not in privation. You're approaching freaking substance. This is the horror. A world of which overemphasizes quantification makes love a privation. It makes relationship the loss of substance. Versus what we've learned from many theologies and many religions is that love is substance. Like relationship is substance. The other is substance. We've literally done a topsy-turvy world where the privation is the very thing that all the religions have said is the substance. We've made that the lack of substance. And that's, and then of course the world seems to be closed in on itself, atomistic and all of these different things, because we've made the good that of which locks us in our own private hell that we call our status and self. And so that's a big problem. So I think basically moving into a world where we take field relationships, the tilling of the soil, all of this, well, when you're really focused on that kind of work, you just, the natural habit you get into because habits are a big thing for sociology, like the habitus, the field of habits you get into. Habits are things you do without thinking about it, right? You just do it, right? Which is based on what you love and what you like to do and what you think is most real, et cetera, so forth, right? The habitus that tends to socially develop under a metaphysics of relation and practices of relation, like the liminal web and social coordination, I think are basically self-forgetfulness. You get in a habit of not thinking about yourself because you're thinking more about the unfolding of the conversation, the tilling of the space. You become much more about vibes and auras and fields. It's not that you degrade yourself. It's not that you start saying, oh, I'm a bad person, or like, it's what Timothy Keller, you just don't think about it. It's like you use your thumb, you just don't think about it, right? But if everything is about quantification, you think about yourself a lot because you're thinking about, how am I quantified? How much money do I have? What status do I have? What recordings do I have? Like, the issue is quantification leads to you think about yourself all the time because you're thinking about how you are quantified to yourself and to others, right? But if you're thinking about relations, then you kind of forget yourself and just use yourself for the stewarding of the quality of the field. You just don't think about yourself. Yeah, you may go and get $1 million, but you don't think of it as in terms of status, but the material and resources needed to increase the quality of the field. To make relationships real doesn't mean you give up on money or give up on status or different things, but you see them as the point of them is not to make you quantifiable to the world in terms of those numbers, but as potential resources to enhance the quality and effectiveness of the field in the social space. That's a very different relationship to money and status and power. Like, one of the dangers, like many religions have had the tension of, how do we tell people that life isn't about status, but at the same time not imply that they shouldn't seek status? How do we tell people that money is not the point of life, but at the same time not demonize money, right? That's always been a problem. You can solve this dilemma if you make the focus quality. Because you simply say, only seek money to the degree that it can be invested to increase the quality of the relationship. If it doesn't, don't seek it. If it does, get it. But if quality is not fundamental, you can't make sense of these choices. How do you choose if you make more money or not? How do you choose if you seek status or not? How do you choose if you work for an institution or not? But if you say, well, can it possibly contribute to the enhancement of the social field in terms of quality, not numbers? Well, now we have a heuristic. Can it increase beauty or not? Now we have a heuristic. Here's the other problem. Take money as a good example. If you ask the question, should I make more money, or should I make money or not, and all you have is quantification, by definition, the answer is yes, you should make more money because you get a bigger number. Quantification always has you do more of the thing. How could quantification ever say do less of the thing? Like, quantification has to be cancerous. It has to overgrow. You can't have an equilibrium growth model in economics or anything if your model of decision making is quantity, because big quantity better than small quantity relative to quantity itself. Now, if you say, well, no, quantity can be bad in the situation. Well, now you've moved into quality, John. The moment you say a quantity is bad at a higher amount, you must have brought in an assessment of quality. That's the only way you could have said that. But if you're sticking in quantity, quantity would always have more. It has to. The logic of quantity intensifies. So then, the only way to keep quantity from getting a game theory life of its own that unfolds into unintentional consequences that auto-cannibalistically destroy us all is to introduce quality. Well, then own it. Ask yourself, does the money increase quality or not? Does the position increase quality or not? And now you're not thinking about doing things in terms of ego and realizing your potential or any of that. You're seeing those questions in terms of possible resources for enhancing the quality of the field of social relationships, friendships, marriages, your life, and opening conditions of possibility of new social possibilities and beauties that otherwise could not occur. And you see them as possibly contributing to that, and thus you can make sense of it. But you cannot make sense of any of those questions of what degree as a Christian should I interact with politics? What degree should I seek money? What degree? You can't make sense of any of these questions unless you're gauging it in terms of the assessment of a quality of life. Quality is basically the only standard of assessment that can save you from pathology. from anxiety, from uncertainty, from madness. It's not by chance that you have a world overwhelmed with mental illness and meaning crisis and nihilism that doesn't have quality as the basis of decision making, because quantity must necessarily eventually lead to overfitting, because its own logic necessarily is increase. And if mental illness is a result of not finding the mean, not finding in beauty is a matter of finding the mean, and money to be sustainable is about finding the mean. You cannot find the mean without quality as your heuristic. And so you're doomed. Like, it has to be. And so quality has to be introduced into our thinking. Otherwise, we end up auto-cannibalized. And so the more we can own that, and the more we can recalibrate epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, our entire subjectivity around the assessment of quality, which then is beauty, and that sort of partial object, and ultimately that leads you to beauty as most fundamental. That is to the degree we can extend humanity versus have our humanity replaced, which is the question of now, and one that we need to take. And yeah, like Michael was saying on gravity, it is funny because, you know, gravity is a field. Gravity is most fundamental. Scientists don't even know what gravity is as a way, which gravity seems to be something like love that creates relationships and different things like that I think about. And then I guess the last thing I would say is if you look through history, and then I'll close, and like, it is incredible how much of the world is made by simply people who are committed to a faithful presence, who simply meet at the Bloomsbury group, who simply continually gather together. They don't know what they're doing is going to change the world. But by being committed to a faithful presence, to a continual activity, they tilled the soil of the social field that had incredible impact on the world, not because they planned it, but because they committed to that faithful presence and to that space. And following a Seldrick, that adds to the field. Following a Kaufman, that works by non-locality. Those things could all occur. And even if you say, well, all of that physics is nonsense, I don't believe it. You cannot, in my opinion, deny the sociological account of Randall Collins, James Hunter, and all these people who basically, or Latour, or whatever they say, the world is made by network effects. And do you know what networks are primarily a result of? Faithful presences. People who are committed to spaces that stay there and are open to the other and do the work. And I think there's that's the work of the social field. And that's the work in which we can learn to make assessments according to quality. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure, sir. I will go unfold chairs unless it's raining really hard. We will see. I've enjoyed. Jacob, always a treat to see you, sir. Thomas Jockin, always a treat. Thank you, gentlemen. All the best.